The bench outside Millhaven's bus depot had a crack running down its middle, and Nora Voss had memorized every inch of that crack the way most people memorize the ceiling above their childhood bed. She was 18 years old, and she had been sleeping on that bench, or ones very much like it, for 11 days. It was September, which in this part of upstate New York meant the air still carried a bruised warmth during the afternoon, but turned sharp and unforgiving after midnight. Nora wore a gray jacket she had found folded on top of a donation bin outside a church on Elm Street. It was 2 sizes too large and smelled faintly of someone else's cedar closet, someone else's home, someone else's winter. She wore it anyway. She wore it with the sleeves pushed up so her hands were free, and she sat on that cracked bench most mornings with a paper cup of coffee she had gotten from the gas station where the owner, a quiet Laotian man named Mr. Keogh, led her by the smallest size, and then quietly refilled it without charging her again. Nobody in Millhaven knew much about Nora. She had come from a group home in Rochester, aged out of the system on her 18th birthday, with a folder of paperwork, a bus ticket, and $240 in a prepaid card that the state called a transitional fund. The folder said she had been in foster care since she was 4. It listed 3 different placements, 2 schools, 1 counselor named Darlene, who had retired in 2018. It did not list a mother or a father. The line for next of kin was blank. She had chosen Millhaven almost at random. The bus ticket had given her a choice of 3 destinations, and Millhaven was the middle one. She liked the middle. The middle felt like a place where nothing had already been decided. She had not expected to still be on the bench after 11 days. What she had expected, what she had believed, in the careful, practical way of a person who learned early not to hope too widely, was that she would find a room within a week, some kind of work, and build something small and solid from the ground up. She had done harder things. She had survived harder silences. But Millhaven was not cooperating. The apartments required first and last month's rent, and a credit history she did not have. The job she applied for wanted a permanent address. It was the same loop she had read about but never quite believed until she was inside it, turning in circles. On the morning of her 12th day, a woman from the county social services office found her at the bench and sat down beside her without asking permission. Her name was Margaret Helt, and she was the kind of person who wore sensible shoes and carried more files than anyone could reasonably need on a Tuesday morning. "Nora Voss," Margaret said, reading from the top of one folder. "That's me," Nora said. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Not with pity. Nora had learned to read pity very quickly, and this was not it. This was something more like concentration, the look of a person trying to find the right place to begin. "I've been trying to reach you," Margaret said. "Apparently you don't have a working phone. The prepaid ran out." "Right." Margaret set the folder on her knee. "There's something I need to discuss with you. It came through the county property office 3 weeks ago. A name match. Your name." She paused. "Nora, did you know you were listed as the sole heir to a property on Callaway Road?" Nora looked at her without expression. "No," she said. "Neither did we," Margaret said quietly. "Neither did anyone." Margaret drove her out to the county property office that same afternoon. A low brick building with fluorescent lighting and the smell of old paper that Nora found oddly comforting. They sat across a wide desk from a records clerk named Gerald, who had the patient manner of a man who had spent 30 years explaining things that confused people, and who had made peace with the fact that confusion was simply part of the human condition. The deed was in a protective sleeve. Gerald slid it across the desk without ceremony. It was old. The paper had that particular quality of age that goes beyond color, something that happens in the texture, a kind of density that newer paper doesn't have. The document was dated 1987, but there was an amendment attached, a single notarized page dated just 14 months ago, in which the property at 44 Callaway Road, Millhaven, New York, was formally bequeathed to one Nora N. Voss, born July 9, 2005, in the event of the owner's death, with no surviving spouse or direct family of the first degree. The owner's name was listed as Eleanor May Voss. Nora read the name twice. Then she read it a third time. "Voss," she said. "Same last name," Gerald confirmed, as though he understood she was not saying it out loud for him, but for herself. "That could be coincidence," Nora said. "It could be," Gerald said. "We looked into it. The amendment was filed by Eleanor Voss herself, 14 months ago, through an attorney here in town. She passed away 7 months ago." The property sat in legal holding while the county attempted to locate you. Took a while, given your situation. Margaret touched the edge of the desk lightly. "Eleanor Voss was 71 when she died. She lived alone on Callaway Road for most of her adult life. She had no children registered in any county record. No marriage after 1986. Nora sat very still. The fluorescent light hummed above them. Outside the window, a truck moved slowly down Main Street, and somewhere a door closed. "What was my mother's name?" Nora asked, and she was surprised by how level her voice stayed. She had asked this question before, of caseworkers, of a judge once, of Darlene the counselor. She had always been told the same thing, that the records were sealed, that the information was protected, that she would be able to petition when she turned 18. She had turned 18 11 days ago, and had not yet petitioned, partly because she did not know how, and partly because she was sleeping on a bench. Margaret and Gerald exchanged a glance. Gerald opened a second file. "Your birth record lists your mother as Jane Doe," he said carefully. "Which means either the name was unknown at the time, or was deliberately withheld." "Deliberately withheld," Nora repeated. "That's not uncommon when a birth parent requests anonymity." Nora looked back at the deed. Eleanor May Voss. The handwriting of the notarized amendment was thin and slightly uneven. The kind of handwriting that belongs to someone whose hands have begun to give them trouble, but who is still determined to be precise. "Can I see the house?" Nora asked. The key was in a brown envelope in the back of the file. It was an old key, the kind with a wide, flat head and a single tooth at the bottom. It looked like it belonged to a different century. Gerald slid it across the desk. "Technically," he said, "it's already yours." That word, yours, landed somewhere in Nora's chest in a way she was not prepared for. Not joyfully. Not even hopefully. It landed the way something lands when it is too large and too strange and too fragile to be fully held all at once. She took the key. It was heavier than she expected. She had no memory of anyone named Eleanor Voss. She had no memory of Millhaven, no reason to have come here, no explanation for why she had chosen the middle destination on that bus ticket. She told herself this was coincidence, or at least that it might be. She did not entirely believe herself. Callaway Road was at the far edge of town, where the sidewalk gave way to gravel, and the houses sat back from the road with that particular combination of dignity and neglect that belongs to properties that were once cared for and have since been left to manage on their own. The trees on either side were old maples, and in September their leaves had begun the slow turn from green toward rust and amber. And the light that filtered through them onto the road was the color of something being remembered. Number 44 sat at the end of a short gravel path behind a leaning wooden gate. It was a two-story house, or it had been. The white paint was peeling in long strips, and the front porch sagged on the left side, where one of the support posts had rotted through at the base. Two of the upstairs windows were covered from the inside with what looked like cardboard. A willow tree grew very close to the right side of the house, and its branches had grown long enough to lean against the siding, tracing slow patterns in the wood over years of wind. Nora stood at the gate for a long time before opening it. She noticed things in the order that she always noticed things: the route of exit first, then the condition of the structure, then the details that told her something about the person who had lived here. A mailbox with a painted bluebird on the side, now mostly flaked away. A ceramic pot beside the front door with a dead plant in it, the soil so dry it had pulled away from the pot's edges. A small wind chime hanging from the porch ceiling, the metal tubes corroded to a dark brown, though they still moved softly in the breeze. She went up the porch steps carefully, testing each one. Two were soft and gave slightly under her weight. The third was solid. The fourth was fine. The key fit the lock but turned hard. She had to lean into it with the heel of her hand before the mechanism gave with a sound like something exhaling after a long time of being held. The inside of the house smelled of dust and dried wood and something faintly herbal, like old sachets of lavender left in a drawer for too many years. The hallway was narrow, with a wooden floor that was gray with age but still solid underfoot. On the left was a staircase. On the right was a doorway into what had been a sitting room. Nora went right. The sitting room held a worn armchair facing a cold fireplace, a small side table, a bookshelf along one wall, still half full of paperbacks, and a few hardcovers with faded spines. An oval braided rug in faded blues and greens. The curtains were drawn, and in the dimness everything had that quality of suspended time, like a photograph taken of a moment just before something changed. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace there were three things: a small clock that had stopped at 4:22, a glass candle holder with a melted-down stub, and a framed photograph. Nora picked up the photograph. It was a woman, probably in her late 40s in the picture, standing in what looked like a garden. She had dark hair going gray at the temples, and was wearing a blue cardigan. She was not smiling exactly, but there was something in her expression that was close to it, a kind of settled quiet, the expression of someone who has made their peace with where they are standing. Nora studied the woman's face for a long time. She looked for something in it. She did not find it, or at least she could not be certain she did. She set the photograph back on the mantelpiece and went to the bookshelf. The books were ordinary enough: mysteries, a few gardening guides, a volume of poetry that had been read many times based on the creased spine. But on the bottom shelf, behind a row of paperbacks, she found a shoebox. She didn't open it then. She set it on the armchair and looked at it for a moment. Then she went through the rest of the house methodically, the way she did everything, the way the group home had taught her to be thorough before she allowed herself to feel. The kitchen was stripped of food, but still held its pots and dishes. The bathroom had a cracked tile above the tub. There were two bedrooms upstairs, one that had clearly been Eleanor's, with a quilt on the bed and a small wooden vanity with a mirror, and one smaller room at the end of the hall that was entirely empty except for a narrow bed frame without a mattress and a hook on the back of the door. That empty room stopped her. It was painted a very pale yellow, the kind of yellow that had once been brighter. On the windowsill there was a small wooden animal, a rabbit, hand-carved and smoothed by handling, the kind of thing made slowly and deliberately over time. Nora picked it up and turned it over. On the flat base, carved in letters no larger than a grain of rice, was a single word. She had to hold it up close to the window to read it. Nora. She went back to the sitting room and sat in the armchair and opened the shoebox. She did it slowly, not from hesitation, but because she had learned that some things deserved a certain pace, that rushing toward the truth was its own kind of disrespect. Inside the box, organized with the care of someone who understood that organization was a form of love, were the following: a bundle of envelopes held together with a rubber band that had begun to dry and crack, a small notebook with a red cover, a newspaper clipping in a protective plastic sleeve, a second photograph. And at the very bottom, a folded letter sealed with a small piece of tape that had the name Nora written on the outside in the same thin, careful handwriting she recognized from the notarized deed amendment. She did not open the sealed letter first. That felt like the right decision, though she could not entirely explain why. She set it aside and picked up the bundle of envelopes. They were letters, she realized, letters that had been written and addressed and stamped but never sent. The address on each one was the same, the group home in Rochester. The name on each one was the same, Nora Voss, in care of. There were 23 of them. The earliest was dated when Nora would have been 7 years old. The most recent was from 2 years ago. She opened the oldest one first. The handwriting was stronger in that one, less uneven, but unmistakably the same hand. The letter began without a formal greeting. It began the way a person begins a letter, when they have started it so many times in their head that the beginning is already worn smooth. I think about you on your birthday every year. I don't know if that helps anything or if you'll ever read this, but I want you to know it is true. Nora read the letter twice. It was not dramatic. Eleanor, if this was Eleanor, did not explain herself in the first letter. She talked about the garden, about the willow tree that had grown too close to the house, and that she kept meaning to have trimmed and never did. She talked about the town. She talked about the weather in September, which she said was her favorite month. She did not explain why she was writing to a 7-year-old girl she had apparently never met. Nora set that letter down and opened the next one. And then the next. It took her most of the afternoon. The light changed as she read, moving from the flat gray of overcast midday to the low gold of early evening, coming through the dusty curtains in long slanted columns. She did not stop to turn a light on. She read in the dimming room, and the letters built something around her slowly, the way a house is built, one layer at a time. By the 7th or 8th letter, the picture had begun to clarify. Eleanor Voss had been the younger sister of a man named Daniel Voss. Daniel Voss had married a woman in 1984. The woman's name, in that letter, was given only as your grandmother's daughter, and Eleanor explained this indirection by saying simply that some names still cost her something to write. Daniel and his wife had a daughter. The daughter had grown up and, at 19, had become pregnant. The circumstances were not explained in detail. What Eleanor wrote was this: she was very young and very alone, and the people around her were not kind about it. I tried to be kind. I don't know if I was enough. The daughter, Nora's mother, though Eleanor never used that word directly, as if the directness of it was something she was working toward, had placed the baby for adoption. She had asked for the records to be sealed. 6 months later, she had left Millhaven entirely. Eleanor had stayed. The newspaper clipping in the plastic sleeve was an obituary. Not Eleanor's. A man named Daniel Voss, who had died in 2011. The obituary was 3 paragraphs and mentioned a sister named Eleanor who survived him. It mentioned no grandchildren. The notebook was filled with garden notes and occasional observations, but on the last page, in a slightly different ink, were 2 phone numbers and the name of a social worker. One of the numbers had been crossed out. Beside the second number, Eleanor had written, "Called 3 times. They said the records are sealed until she is 18. I understand. I will wait." Nora sat with the notebook in her lap for a while. Outside, The wind moved through the willow tree, and its branches brushed the side of the house in an irregular, gentle rhythm. Eleanor had known. Eleanor had always known. She had found out about Nora, and had spent more than a decade writing letters she never sent, and waiting for a birthday she wasn't sure she'd live to see. The sealed letter was still on the side table. Nora looked at it in the growing dark. She was not ready yet. She stood up and found the light switch in the hallway, and turned on the single bare bulb that still worked. And then she went to the kitchen, and filled a glass of water from the tap, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard. There was a garden out there. Overgrown now, weedy and collapsed in on itself, but she could see the structure of it under the neglect, the rows, the borders, the places where someone had once planted things with intention. She drank the water. Then she went back to the sitting room, and sat down, and picked up the sealed letter. The tape had dried enough that it released without tearing the paper. Inside was a single sheet, folded in thirds. The handwriting was the most uneven of all the letters she had read that day, and Nora understood without being told that this one had been written late in Eleanor's life, when the difficulty of writing had become significant. And yet it was the most precise. It was the one that had been thought about the longest. It began, "Dear Nora, I am calling you that because I was the one who suggested it. That is the first thing I want you to know." Nora read that sentence 3 times before she continued. Eleanor explained it plainly, without drama, the way a person explains something they have carried quietly for many years. When Nora's mother, whose name was Clara, Eleanor wrote, "And I am ready to write it now," was preparing to place the baby for adoption, she had been asked if she wanted to choose a name. She had said she couldn't. She had said she couldn't bring herself to name the child because naming the child would make a certain kind of leaving impossible. Eleanor had been in the room. She was the only family who was. She had said, "Then let me. Just the first name. You don't have to keep it. But let there be a name." And Clara had nodded and turned toward the window. Eleanor had said, "Nora." It was her own mother's name. A name that had been quiet in the family for many years, belonging to a woman who had been gentle and who had died too young. She had given it to this new small person as a kind of quiet continuity, a thread between what had been and what was just beginning. Clara had left 2 days later. She had sent Eleanor one letter from somewhere in Ohio, and then nothing more. Eleanor had tried for several years to find her, and eventually understood that Clara did not wish to be found, and that this was Clara's right, and that honoring it was the only form of love left available. Eleanor had turned to Nora then. Not physically. She had no access to the baby, who had been placed through the state system and whose records were sealed. She had turned toward Nora the way you turn toward a compass point, not arriving there, but orienting by it. "I want to explain something," Eleanor wrote, and here the handwriting slowed further, became even more deliberate. "I know this house is not much. I know you will walk in and see all the ways it has fallen apart. I could not keep it the way I once could. But I kept it. I kept it because I did not know who else was keeping something for you. I didn't know if anyone was. And I thought, if she ever comes, if she ever gets old enough and the records open and she finds her way here, there should be something. There should be a place. Even a broken one is better than none." Nora stopped reading. She was not crying. She was very still, the way she went still when something was too large to immediately process, when the body needed a moment before the mind could continue. She looked around the sitting room. The stopped clock. The melted candle. The braided rug. The half-full bookshelf. Eleanor had kept this house for her. Not to leave her property, not in any material or transactional sense. She had kept it in the older sense of the word. She had tended to it, stayed with it, remained as its witness, for 30 years, alone in this leaning house on Callaway Road. Because she believed that somewhere in the world there was a girl named Nora, who might one day need to know that someone had been thinking of her. The letter continued for one more paragraph. I don't ask you to forgive anything. I'm not sure what there is to forgive. Your mother was young and frightened, and I don't think she did what she did out of cruelty. I think she did it because she was trying to give you something better than what she had. Whether she was right, I cannot say. I only know what I did, and what I hoped for. I hoped you would be safe. I hoped you would be stubborn. You have to be stubborn, I think, to survive the things you have survived. And I hoped that one day you would stand in this house and feel, however imperfectly, that you had come from somewhere. That you had not simply appeared in the world without a root. You have a root, Nora. It is old and weathered and a bit lopsided, like everything in this house. But it is yours. It has always been yours. Eleanor Nora folded the letter very carefully and held it in both hands. Through the window, the September night had arrived fully, and the willow tree was just a shape against the dark, moving slowly. She held the letter for a long time. Then she picked up the carved wooden rabbit from where she had set it on the side table beside the lamp. She turned it over and held it in the light, and looked at the small letters on the base. Nora. She had been named before she had a name. She had been held in someone's attention before she had any knowledge of it. The entire architecture of her loneliness, the blank line on every form, the sealed records, the bench with a crack down the middle, had existed alongside something she had never been able to see. A woman in a house at the end of a gravel path, sitting in an armchair, writing letters in the dimming light. The discovery she had made in this house was not the house itself. The house was the smallest part of it. What she had found was evidence of being loved in the only way that had been possible. Quietly from a distance, for a very long time. She was 18 years old, and she was sitting in a broken house that was hers. She did not feel rich. She did not feel rescued. She felt, for the first time in her memory, located. Nora stayed in the house that night, and then the night after that, and then she simply kept staying. Margaret from the county office helped her navigate the legal transfer of the deed, which took 6 weeks and required more paper than Nora had thought could possibly be related to a single falling down house. There were property taxes in arrears, a modest amount that was eventually waived through a county hardship provision that Margaret knew about and Nora did not. There was an inspection, and the inspector, a tired man named Ron, walked through each room making notes on a clipboard and told her with genuine sadness that the porch needed to be rebuilt. The roof had at least 3 soft spots. One of the upstairs windows had a failed seal that had allowed moisture into the wall. And the furnace was original to 1967 and should be considered decorative rather than functional. "Can it be fixed?" Nora asked. Ron looked at her. He had probably seen people walk away from houses in worse condition. "Everything can be fixed," he said. "Question is usually whether it's worth it." "It's worth it," Nora said, and there was no performance in the way she said it. She found work at Mr. Keogh's gas station, who had already given her more coffee than she had paid for and who had, she suspected, recognized something in her long before she recognized it in herself. She worked the morning shift and spent her afternoons in the house, cleaning what could be cleaned, learning what needed to be learned. She was not a person who had been taught practical things, but she was a person who could read instructions, watch videos on the library computer, and ask questions without embarrassment. She learned to caulk a window. She learned which boards were cosmetic and which were structural. She learned that old houses make sounds at night that are not threatening, just the wood adjusting to temperature, to memory, to the presence of a new inhabitant. She read all 23 unsent letters twice more over the course of the winter. She read them slowly, in order, watching Eleanor's life accumulate across the years in small observations: the willow tree, the garden, the town changing around her. A neighbor who brought soup when Eleanor was ill in 2019, the particular quality of light in the sitting room in January. She read them as a record of steadiness, of someone who had decided on a direction, and kept it without deviation even when there was no sign that it mattered. She thought about Clara too. Clara, who had been 19 and frightened, and had turned toward the window, because she could not name what she was leaving. Nora spent a long time in the empty yellow room thinking about that. She was not without anger. She was honest enough to admit it existed, a thin thread of it buried beneath everything else. But anger was not the dominant thing. What was dominant was something more like comprehension. She was 18, had survived things that Clara at 19 probably couldn't have imagined surviving, and she still could not say with certainty what she would have done at 19, alone, with no good options, and a family that was not kind. She did not try to find Clara. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She held that as an open question, a door that was neither locked nor open, just resting on its hinges. In early spring, she fixed the front porch with help from a retired carpenter named Bill, who lived 2 streets over and who, it turned out, had known Eleanor in the last years of her life. He came over one Saturday morning unannounced, and stood looking at the sagging porch with his hands in his pockets. "Eleanor used to sit out here in the evenings," he said. "Did she talk about herself much?" Nora asked. Bill thought about it. "Not much. She talked about her garden, about books, about the town." He paused. "She talked about waiting sometimes. I never quite knew what she meant by it." "I think I do," Nora said. "They rebuilt the porch over 3 weekends." It was solid when they finished, and Nora stood on it the first warm evening of April and looked out at the maple trees along Callaway Road with their new green coming in. And she felt the boards holding her weight without any give at all, and something in her chest settled in a way she had been waiting her whole life for something to settle. The garden took longer. She began working on it in March when the ground was still half frozen, pulling out the dead growth and the weeds that had taken over, learning what was salvageable and what had to be started from seed. She found, under years of overgrowth, that Eleanor had grown lavender along the south border, which explained the smell she had noticed on her first day, and that at least some of the lavender plants were still alive at the root. She kept them. By summer, the house was not beautiful. It was not finished. It probably would not be finished for years, if it was ever entirely finished, because old houses are like that. They give you a continuous conversation rather than a resolution. But it was lived in, which is not the same as beautiful but is, in its own way, more important. Nora kept the shoebox on the shelf in the sitting room. She kept the carved rabbit on the windowsill in the yellow room, which she was slowly making into a space she could use. Adding a small desk and a second-hand chair and a lamp she found at the town's annual rummage sale. She kept the framed photograph of Eleanor on the mantelpiece, where it had always been, and she got used to seeing it there the way you get used to the particular view from a window, until it becomes part of how you understand where you are. She thought sometimes about the 11 days she had spent on that bench. She thought about how she had chosen the middle destination on the bus ticket without knowing why. She was not a mystical person, had never been taught to be, but she found she could not explain it in purely rational terms either. She let it stay unexplained. Some things are better as questions than as answers. She did not know what she would become. She was 18, and then she was 19, and the house was still standing around her, still asking things of her, still giving her back small discoveries, a hand-painted tile behind the bathroom mirror, a mark on the kitchen doorframe where someone had recorded a child's height in pencil. Though whose child, and when she could not know. What she knew was this: she had come into the world without an explanation, and she had been given one, late and partial and imperfect as all true explanations are. She had been given a name, chosen by a woman who had sat in the same armchair in the same fading light, and decided that the least she could do was offer that much. One name, one thread. One point of connection thrown across the distance of closed records and sealed doors, and the enormous silence of the state. Eleanor had called it a route. Standing on the rebuilt porch in the early evening, watching the maples move in the wind on Callaway Road, Nora thought that was the right word. Not a foundation. A foundation is planned and poured and certain. A root is something that grows toward what it needs, in the dark, without being able to see, trusting only that there is something worth reaching for. She had been reaching her whole life without knowing it. She had reached all the way to the middle destination on a bus ticket, to a cracked bench, to a brown envelope holding an old key. She had reached all the way home.